Hey everybody, it's Stuart and I'm so glad that you're here watching this video. Today I'll be bringing you some research related to self-talk. Now I know that's something that's kind of like a throwaway line, but trust me, it's going to be really fascinating. I found it very intriguing because all of a sudden, now I know how to utilize self-talk to its maximum capacity rather than just crossing my fingers and hoping that some affirmation will work. So let me dive into the literature and I'll give you a little bit of insight in terms of how this whole thing works. First, let's talk about what exactly self-talk is. It basically is contained in two key criteria. Number one, the fact that you're utilizing some kind of a linguistic measure in order to get inside of your head. Number two, it is actually something that you're having a dialogue with. Number two is actually you having a dialogue with yourself. In other words, there's nobody else involved. Focus on the fact that the messenger is also the recipient. I'm going to talk about two key branches of self-talk, and then I will do my best to make it as simple and as layman as possible. The first component is known as organic self-talk. Now, organic self-talk is one of those moments where you spontaneously speak to yourself. Whether you're ruminating or whether you're thinking about a person, organic self-talk is very common. So for example, if I asked you, what was the first thing you had for breakfast? Chances are you'll start asking yourself some questions, and that's a form of organic self-talk. This, however, is reflexive self-talk because I'm triggering it with a question. Reflexive basically means that it's a reaction to something on the outside. Organic is something that you spontaneously create from the inside. Now that we know what organic self-talk is, I'll refer to it as organic self-talk. Let's move over to the other one, which is a little bit more deliberate, which is strategic self-talk. Now, strategic self-talk takes on multiple elements. For example, that self-talk could be goal-directed. And goal-directed is primarily a kind of self-talk that gets you to move towards your goals. And the bad news is that goal-directed self-talk is not always going to work because it depends on how you use it. For example, you can have procedural or instructional self-talk. And what that basically means is that you're giving yourself a step-by-step walkthrough of what you need to do in order to arrive at your goal. Conversely, you also have motivational self-talk, which is more to give you an internal pep talk. These two, depending on the kind of situation that you're in, will determine whether or not you actually move better towards your goals. And this is the key in strategic self-talk. Why is it called strategic self-talk? Well, basically, it's because it is strategically placed as a tactic to get you to self-cue. Now, self-cueing is a very powerful skill, and if you know how to cue specific moments and have the specific kind of talk that is in line with the objective that you want to accomplish, you're basically unstoppable. So if, for example, you know that sometime in the future you will get upset because someone will say something nasty to you, you will install an internal self-talk cue so that whenever that happens, you simply rely on your own self-talk to keep your emotional baseline flat. So as we dive into further parts of the literature, you'll begin to realize how this kind of self-talk is going to add up and why you need to go through the impact approach to planning out your entire self-talk routine. Essentially, under the umbrella of self-leadership, which is a very crucial concept where self-talk can be utilized. After all, when you're leading yourself, you expect to be able to have some control over your emotions. There are two things which are not directly related to self-talk literature, but I'll talk about them first. The first thing is about situation selection. What exactly is situation selection? Has there ever been a time where you knew that there was going to be a high risk of something happening that would upset you, and therefore you just don't want to go there? That's situation selection. In other words, you are selecting whether or not to be in that environment in the first place. So situation selection, of course, is sometimes avoidance, sometimes is a very conscious way of planning how you challenge yourself, but situation selection does not always assist you in utilizing your self-talk to the maximum. The second area, which is a little bit more relevant, is the sphere of response modulation. The science calls it response modulation. You can call it emotional management. Now, managing your emotions is no simple feat, right? Especially when you get really upset by people or really upset by situations. It's a little bit of a tussle to dive in and just start saying that, oh, I got to get my self-talk in check. There's more to it than meets the eye. In fact, I'm going to cover two key aspects of the self-talk literature that will give you some idea in terms of what you can do and when you ought to do it. It is said that whenever your attention goes somewhere, you're utilizing some kind of internal resource. So attentional deployment is actually quite crucial. Take, for example, the idea that Whenever you're attending to something, you can't seem to pay attention to anything else, isn't it? The amount of attention that we have is going to be split, and as a result, we need to have self-talk to redirect our attention. This is known as attentional deployment. There are two ways by which your attention can be diluted. Number one is through distractions. You know, the kind of situation where you're sitting down and trying to get your work done, but something else draws your attention, like a Facebook notification or WhatsApp notification, or even worse, loud random noises that just happen to be around you. So whenever you encounter this, the use of self-talk can function as an attention deployment tool so that you use less resources in trying to combat distractions. Another very interesting area of deployment is through the use of internal distractions. For example, a lot of ruminations, a lot of self-talk, and basically a messy mind. Whenever this happens, using self-talk can actually guide you towards becoming a little bit more grounded. And I'll show you a few examples in a short while. The second one is through cognitive change. Now, cognitive change is a fancy term of just simply saying that you're changing your thoughts, you're changing your belief system. Now, in order for this to happen, you need to recognize that there are two forms of cognitive change. The first one is called reappraisal. It's another fancy word for saying that you're simply reframing the situation by looking out at different perspectives so that you can consider the situation slightly differently. As I usually say, when you are stuck, it's because you are stuck in your perspective. And once you've shifted your perspective, you tend to have a lot more freedom of thought and freedom of action. The second way is actually suppression. So for example, you can tell yourself to stop thinking about something. There's something known as an ironic effect in self-talk. We're going to look into that in a short while. I'm going to dive into the science that talks about attentional deployment. Remember, attentional deployment is how you're attending to certain things and focusing so that you don't get distracted, whether internally or externally. In 2017, Galanis et al. Wrote a paper talking about how different individuals within groups actually were able to combat the effects of distraction. There were a group of 28 males, one group of which was subdivided into the control group, and the other one was given self-talk training. And the other field study was based off 28 female basketball players, and the same conditions applied as well, where one was a control group and the other group was given a 6-week intervention in self-talk training. The baseline of the control group did not perform as well as the group that was given self-talk training to suppress the distractions that were going on around them. So what this means for you is that if you encounter a distraction, sometimes the utilization of some kind of a self-talk mechanism can help you to suppress or at least drive your attention to focus on the things that are more important for you at that point of time. I remember myself having 1,001 things to do, but then once I was able to get clear on doing all of those things in priority, it most certainly helped me to attend to what I needed to do. So I was able to utilize instructional self-talk. Alright, there's too many things on your mind right now, Stuart. Just make a list of all the things that you need to get done. What are the things that you need to delegate, and what are the things that you have to do today and immediately? Write those down now. Right, write that down, and after some time, it becomes very clear that I know exactly what I need to do. More importantly, the research has shown that if you just write down a to-do list, it's not going to help you. You need to transfer it to a calendar so that you have sufficient time to get that task done. The next one has got to do with response modulation. Now, what exactly is response modulation? We mentioned it earlier. It was emotional management. Now, when you are able to control your emotions, you literally have a superpower. Hayes et al. In 2019, which talks specifically about what happens when you have a threat condition and a challenge condition. Now, what those two basically mean is you can take a look at one thing like a wild lion, and you can either treat it as a threat, where a huge amount of anxiety begins to boil up inside of you, or as a challenge, where anxiety turns into a sense of motivation. There is an implication to this. For most people, they know that treating situations as a threat is going to cause you a lot of negative emotions, and as a result, you won't be able to perform as well under almost all situations. In fact, this was tabled by Jones et al. In 2009. One of the key steps that can happen is to allow yourself to reframe the situation first. Now, reframing is a very delicate and powerful strategy. If you know how to utilize it, it becomes really powerful. If you're in a threat state, for example, after about 45 minutes in a particular game, you realize you're trailing by many points, and as a result, you start feeling the anxiety build up. The unfortunate thing under those circumstances is that the more you think about the threat, the less likely you will perform well. Hence, you need to reframe so that you no longer look at it as a threat. How do you do reframing? Well, there are two types of reframing. The first one is known as content reframing. So if somebody calls you lazy, you can treat it as an insult and get very upset, treating that as a threat and therefore causing yourself to go into unnecessary volatile emotions. Conversely, you can simply look at it as, well, being lazy can be good. After all, I'm having a break right now, and utilize that as a means to calm yourself or to get into a more appropriate emotional state. So reframing can be content-oriented, simply taking a word and asking yourself, what else can this mean? After all, in most situations, being lazy doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. Sometimes being lazy is a form of creativity. You need to garner the right amount of time and the right timing in order to have multiple ideas triangulate on each other in order to come out with a blissfully creative idea. On the other hand, there's another approach known as context reframing. In other words, where will this behavior be deemed as appropriate or inappropriate? For instance, if you're a comedian, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be funny all the time. And I know for a fact that if you're a comedy act at somebody's funeral without being invited, that's going to be inviting trouble. Changing your perspective can be a bit of a finicky thing. I've seen people attempt to use reframing with very little result. I think the reason is because they need to understand the context by which they're doing the reframe, and they need to reassess the beliefs that they have so that whenever they do a reframe, it actually does deeply affect them and it shifts their beliefs. A lot of the time, it's very tough for an individual to reframe themselves. We're all biased creatures. So if we reframe and we're unable to shift our beliefs, it's no wonder why psychologists, counselors, and therapists, and coaches these days, are utilizing reframing, because they, as a third-party observer to your behaviors, can actually detect the changes that are required or the shift of perspective that you need. So once again, reframing can be content and meaning-based, thereby changing what it means to use that word, and it can be context-based, meaning that you can shift the location, the time period, as well as the situation so that that behavior becomes either more appropriate or less appropriate. Another interesting thing is the function of distracting internal emotions, such as anxiety. Now, when you're very high in anxiety, it's very likely that you won't be able to concentrate no matter how hard you try. So that's one of the reasons why there are interventions such as mindfulness, breathing meditations, and so on, so that you can alleviate yourself from some of this anxiety. But I also know people whom the more they try to do this meditation, the more this entire mental spiel takes over them and causes them to go into a grip. There are ways to deal with this. Hatzigeorgiadis in 2017 and 2009, together with his co-authors, suggested that the use of goal-directed self-talk can actually help you to get out of debilitative experiences as well as threat experiences. For example, if you're noticing yourself in a threat situation, aside from just doing a cognitive reframe, what you could do is simply talk yourself through a known procedure. This is what happens, by the way, for most people in emergency situations. I've been trained in trauma therapy and trauma intervention. One of the things I've been taught is to ground the person in the reality. So inside my mind, I notice something happening. Rather than panic, I keep that person grounded and I tell that person, look, this is what happened to you. There's some glass that has gotten into your face. It seems to have surrounded your eye. I'm here with you. The ambulance will be arriving in about 3 minutes. I've called them and you are in good hands. Now, by grounding them, this procedure prevents me or the patient from actually spiraling out of negative control. So imagine you're facing the same threat situation. What can you do? Basically, get yourself grounded. Tell yourself, okay, let's stabilize the situation. What can we do next? What's the next step after that? And the next step after that? Chances are you'll need some kind of strategic self-talk in order for you to gain this instructional advantage. It'll be very helpful for you to walk through procedures. In previous videos, I talked about something called the tote pattern. It is a form of atomizing behaviors into specific steps inside the mind so that I can anticipate a certain outcome based on the things that I'm doing. So bear in mind that the threat situation is more effectively dealt with whenever you have a self-talk that is garnered towards following a procedure. It's very helpful, and that's another reason why fire drills, emergency drills all require specific procedures. In reducing anxiety, one approach is also to apply a rational approach. In other words, to challenge whether or not your belief is truly rational or irrational. And if you have somebody who's a well-trained therapist or a coach, they can identify whether your outcomes are rational or irrational. Now, what this means is that you can apply questions as a means of grounding yourself to the rational. What Turner et al. Found in 2018 when they were doing a field study with golf players was that the putting experience was far better when they were utilizing rational self-talk rather than irrational self-talk. Now, that sounds pretty trite, isn't it? But if you don't have a proper set of ways of talking to yourself and you apply self-talk, it's more likely to turn out to be irrational in the spur of your emotions. So just in sum, what we want to do is to take our negative self-talk and turn it into something rational. We also want to be able to take threat-oriented situations and reframe them so that we can utilize the challenge state as a means of motivating ourselves. I neglected to mention earlier on that in the challenge state, you can utilize motivational self-talk in order to get you toward your goal. When you have threats or a sense of anxiety, utilizing rational thought as well as a means of talking yourself through the procedures that you've prepared strategically before, it's more likely to help you to move ahead. What I'd like you to think about are the ways by which you can activate this. Back in the workplace, I'm pretty sure that there are situations where you need to activate cue-based self-talk. And this kind of strategic self-talk is necessary for you so that you can perform at a much higher level than ever before. In order for you to do this, I'm going to run through something that is known as the Impact Strategic Self-Talk Model. So these 6 components include I. Identify what you have to achieve. In neurolinguistic programming, we frequently refer to something known as a well-formed outcome. In other words, you put yourself there. You don't use words like I will, you say I am. And you utilize your senses, the visual, auditory, kinesthetic senses, in order to share a statement of what it is like to already be there, as if you're there. Also, this form of outcome planning has to be based on your volition. In other words, you have to be the one carrying it out, not a goal based on what other people need to carry out. And finally, it has to be ecological, in a sense that you can't take an action that's going to cause you more problems or upset the balance of your current system at the moment. M. Match your self-talk to your needs. So for example, if you wanted to make $1 million this year, your self-talk shouldn't be, oh my gosh, it's gonna be really difficult. Instead, it ought to be a little bit more facilitative and it should be encouraging as well. So if you match your self-talk like, come on, we can do this, that's just motivational in nature. Sometimes, the problem with most people is that they apply motivational self-talk on something they have no clue of implementing. And at the end of the day, they flounder. And they are unable to arrive at the goal, and therefore it causes them a lot more distress because they thought that they tried everything, but the truth is they did not go through the process of really identifying what they needed to do. Suppose you know exactly what you need to do, the exact procedures. Motivating yourself is going to be quite easy. If you match the self-talk procedurally on a task that requires you to go through procedures, that could give you a higher level of precision. Now look, I've done this on video editing for many hundreds of hours of videos that I've created, and I've come to realize that if I don't have a set of procedures in front of me and to be able to talk through myself in each and every stage, I'm going to get messed up inside my head, not knowing what effect to draw, which function of the software I need to use, and so on. And I'm going to get really, really upset because I'm just going to reduce my productivity. So M, match your self-talk to your needs. P, practice different cues with consistency. For example, if you use the phrase, calm down. Now what's important is to have a consistency of it. So if you were to close your eyes and imagine yourself in that situation, test out that self-talk cue. Does it help you? And if it does, subjectively, then it's good enough. In this particular case, practicing with consistency is not as important, in my opinion, as practicing with intensity. Take, for example, you being able to calm down in the face of a major threat. Instead of just saying, oh my gosh, this is going to be really difficult, you will say, calm down. And remember, the intensity of that calm has to go into your body. You need to see, hear, and feel it as if you're there. So you will breathe the way you breathe, you sit the way you sit, you put on the right kinds of facial expressions as if you're calm and at peace. So you want to increase the level of calmness to a high enough level so that whatever it is that you're doing or whatever it is that you're facing is going to be met with extreme calm. A. Ascertain which cues work best for you. Now, as we mentioned earlier on, there are auditory cues such as phrases or even sounds. If they work for you, that's good enough. All you need to do is to check within your internal self to notice that it does have an effect on you. Now, do remember that it's not just auditory cues. And while this may not be the domain of self-talk itself, it might be helpful for you to think about visual cues such as colors or people's faces. And as a result, you utilize the entire environment around you in order to trigger off effective self-talk. C. Create specific self-talk plans. In other words, in anticipation of the future, you're going to simulate different situations and then ask yourself, what do I trigger under condition A, B, C, and D? Once you're able to identify all of these as a baseline, it will become so much easier for your mind to wrap itself around what it needs to execute at that point of time. So it's really powerful. All I need to do is think, wow, I'm going to need calmness in this situation. I'm going to need excitement in that situation. And I'm going to need to be focused and attentive in this other situation. So whenever I have that, I'll activate self-talk cues to say, okay, it's time for me to put away my phone. It's time for me to pay attention to this person deeply. I'm pretty sure that will help your relationships, right? Especially your intimate and family relationships, but it's also going to go a long way as a leader. At the same time, you could activate calm and peace whenever you're feeling upset by a certain mistake that you might have made, giving you a sense of self-compassion too. All of these states are more likely to help you in your favor. The last T is to train your self-talk to perfection. What that means is that you need to take a look around you and start attempting to test yourself. So what I typically do is the use of future pacing. I'll go into the future randomly, perhaps while I'm having my lunch, and imagining a situation where a trigger may occur, and I'll see how my mind responds to it. So if the training had done its job, I'll start experiencing the behavioral response that is in tandem with the self-talk cue that I plan for myself. In sports, the use of self-talk cues is really powerful because within that hour or two or so, you can actually trigger these self-talk mechanisms for a huge number of purposes. When you're starting a race, when you're in the middle of the race and you're really tired, what if you get injured? Do you pick yourself up and keep going? Are you able to procedurally get yourself to keep going so that you can still be in the running for top 10, for example? All of this is to stretch your mind towards what's possible. However, some people may comment that, look, in business and relationships, it's not just an hour or two. It's sometimes weeks, months, or even years. In which case, how do I continue to do this? Well, as I always say, take an elephant and dice it up into small bits so that you can eat it. Once you notice that business is about specific things, maybe you want to drive traffic. Even within driving traffic, there are components of driving traffic. Selecting the right platform, being able to put up the right ads, being able to select the right kinds of words to use, and so on, all factor in to making it really, really concrete and very specific. The more specific, the easier it is for your brain to recognize that this is the event that I need to activate my self-talk cues. See? So every time I'm in a situation, it could be planning a strategic retreat for my team. It could be running an event. All of these things will require me to break things down into very specific chunks. And once they are in specifics, it's easier for me to implement some of these self-talk routines. Always remember, strategic self-talk is about pre-fixed cues. So you're going to have specific words or phrases or sounds that will then trigger you to actually take action in the future. You'll also need to anticipate when you'll use it. Now this is something that's commonly missed out. For example, you can think about the 101 ways a cycling competition could go wrong and ask yourself, if let's say you encountered different situations, maybe you get mangled with another bunch of cyclists, what are you going to do? How are you going to recover and how are you going to catch up? Those are significant because there's a goal-directed self-talk that needs to be instituted at that point of time. What if you got bad news halfway through? For example, someone at home is facing some kind of trouble. If that's the case, are you able to shift that towards helping you to get to the goal faster? or are you going to use that to give up? A lot of the time, the way we cue ourselves internally is so crucial. So I'd like to encourage all of you to have a plan. Have this plan of action, write it down on paper if you need to, and then test it out over time utilizing the impact strategy. Finally, this note on ironic effects. There are two kinds of ironic effects. The first one is when you get so obsessed with a goal that you're only focusing on achieving the result and nothing else. And the more you strive towards it, the more tense you become. Now, if you're like this, what you need to do is to activate reflexive self-talk. When you notice it, you tell yourself, calm down, relax, lean into it, ease up. All of these phrases can actually remind you to get back into the groove, get back into the flow. Another ironic self-talk is where suppression is concerned. A lot of the time, the reason why emotions emerge from within is because they are trying to tell you something. In neuro-linguistic programming training, I tell people that this is like a messenger attempting to deliver a crucial message. So if you listen, chances are you'll know how to take action. But if you don't listen, you won't know how to take action. As a result, I don't want to feel anxious. I don't want to feel anxious. The studies by Wenger in 1994 highlight that the more you attempt to suppress these, the more likely you end up creating more anxiety instead. So it's better for you to learn to do this. In a study by Wagstaff and Weston in 2014, they studied a group of military personnel who were trekking for 2 months during an Antarctic mountaineering expedition, and they found that the pressure that they were experiencing was best served by expressive suppression. In other words, not to say anything and to just simply hold down expressing any negative thoughts together with a condition of acceptance. Now, this is a game changer because when you learn to accept things as if they are a fact, it becomes easier for you to think through it logically and rationally. So if you found yourself with a huge amount of anxiety, all you really need to do is to acknowledge that, hey, I'm quite anxious. Let's lean into that and let's work on that. What do we need to do next? And then you can use some of your strategic self-talk to instruct yourself through what you need to do. Another piece of research in the self-leadership domain came up. And this was by Houghton et al. In 2007, where they found that dysfunctional thinking, such as dysfunctional thought processes that are irrational in nature, sometimes are the reason why there is a low job satisfaction in the first place. You are responsible for your own levels of satisfaction. You're the one who needs to be able to tell yourself how to proceed and how to pursue your goals and your directions in spite of difficulty so that job satisfaction actually increases. So contrary to popular belief, it's not just the use of your strengths, it's not just the use of corporate structures of kindness and positivity alone. It really is the ability for you to push through a challenge by focusing on goal orientation. Now, I did mention previously in many of my videos that if you don't get practice doing something, chances are you're not going to like that activity. The more you do it, the more you grow into that activity. Take, for example, all the anecdotal evidence that I've seen from gym goers who sustain their behavior. Most of the time, by the time they get really good at it, they like it a lot. When they first started out, they didn't like it at all. So if you find yourself saying, I don't quite like this and it's not my strength, think again. It's not your strength because you've not practiced. And because you've not practiced, it's going to take you even more time because you're trying to avoid something. You're trying to avoid the situation where you have to practice, which sometimes gives you lousy results, right? So I recommend that you lean into coaching and learning. The more you learn, the more you get coached, the more effective it will be for you to develop a certain set of competencies that are more than likely to develop over the course of 4, maybe 3 years. And if you think about that, that might very well be something worth pursuing. Whatever the case, my friends, I hope that this was beneficial and fascinating for you as it was for me. Now I know that there's a mechanism for me to utilize on a consistent basis. Sure, some of you won't be able to use it very effectively because you don't have all of the tools at your disposal. But as I've mentioned, stay tuned on this channel, click the like and the subscribe button so that you can get notifications on all of my other videos. Some of my videos cover strategies such as submodalities, which actually hold the key to enhancing your internal mental intensity of your self-talk so that they're more compelling and help you to drive home a point more effectively internally. So stay tuned on my channel so that you can raise yourself beyond challenge and suffering and arrive at a place where you can take actions for abundance.